good.
Hello and welcome everyone to the fourth edition of Ananke's Women in Literature Festival. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you all and welcome my honored guests, Ahmad Rin, Naima Rashid, and Sabine Javeri. A little bit about our three panelists. Ahmad Rin is a Welsh Pakistani writer and translator. His debut novel, For Dervishes by Serene Books, was longlisted for the British Science Fiction Association Award in 2022. He translated Naveen Kishore's debut poetry collection, Knotted Grief, into Urdu under the title Uljha Gham, published by Zuka Books in 2022. Ahmad did a BA in English and Persian literature at the Punjab University, Lahore, and an MA in filmmaking at the Kingston University, London. A passionate language enthusiast, he teaches a number of languages, including Persian and Urdu, and has led workshops on creative writing and ghazal. In addition to working on his second novel, Ahmad is currently translating works by Palestinian poet Najwan Darwish into Urdu, as well as working along Welsh poet. Ahmad, can you?
Iestyn
on a Welsh translation of Darwish's work. So welcome, Ahmad.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very nice to be here. Thank you.
Naima Rashid is an author, poet, and translator working between Urdu, French, Punjabi, and English. Her published works include Naulakhi Koti, Defiance of the Rose, and Chikanis. She has translated works by renowned Urdu writers Parveen Shakir and Ali Akbar Natiq to critical acclaim. Her fourth book, a poetry collection, Sum of Worlds, is forthcoming from Yoda Press this year, followed by her fiction. Widely published internationally, her work has been longlisted for the National Poetry Competition and Best Small Fiction. She is member of the UK-based translation collective Shadow Heroes, and her website is www.naimarashid.com. Sabine Javeri is an award-winning short story writer, essayist, translator, and novelist. She is a professor of literature and creative writing. She holds a Master's of Studies from Oxford University and a doctorate from the University of Leicester. Her first book, Nobody Killed Her, was published by HarperCollins in 2017 and Hijabistan in 2019. Her text on creative writing has been widely published, and she has edited two multilingual anthologies titled Urdu, Arzu, Anthology of Student Voices. Her research explores feminist literature of the subcontinent and decolonizing pedagogies. Sabine, there is another book, if you could tell us about that as well.
Yeah, sure. I think that's an old bio. I recently put together an anthology of creative nonfiction by Pakistani women writers. It's called Ways of Being, and it came out by Women Unlimited Press.
Thank you so much for that. So welcome, everyone. And I'd like to begin this session with, talking about language and the role of literature. There's so many layers to the meaning and interpretations when it comes to the term language. For many, it is a verbal communication. Some interpret it as a form of engagement. It can also be viewed as a tool wielding imperialist power, and on the flip side, a crutch of the marginalized. We all know language is that and so much more. It's not just expressed verbally. Silence has a language. Violence has a language. I remember, vaguely remember, in the 1980s, when you saw these newspapers, Dawn and other newspapers, there were, blank spaces. So that also told a story. So my question is, as authors and academicians and as thinkers, what is your perception of language, especially in this postmodern, neo-colonist world apocalyptic world that we live in today? We can start with Hamad.
Sure, yes. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to invite me to this panel. And some of these questions have been at the forefront of my creative consciousness and conscience as well. Questions about language, its role in today's society in various ways, in various aspects, and the role of literature as well. But definitely, language is much more than just an arrangement of sounds or a tool of communication. It's the expression of it's an expression of cultural identity, a repository of cultural heritage, and through literature, folklore, and storytelling, it also transmits values, traditions, beliefs across generations. So it definitely plays a much wider role in the world, than just being a tool of communication. And in terms of literature, for example, when we talk about one of the earliest forms of written literature, if we think about Sumerian and Akkadian, two ancient languages, which are now dead. Nobody speaks either of these languages. But one of the earliest epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written in Sumerian first and then Akkadian. And through that epic, these two languages are still alive in a way. And in fact, if I may digress, some of the words found in the international vocabulary, for example, the word dragoman, the word souk, which is a Middle Eastern marketplace, and tanur, or tandoori roti, for example, tandoori naan. These words come from Akkadian and were first attested in this epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in a way, that literary corpus, that epic, has enabled these languages to live across across the millennia. So definitely, I mean, language is a repository of not just the cultural expression, but also an expression of heritage and much more. Yes.
Naima?
Yeah, building up on what Hamad said about heritage and the influences, the literary or cultural influences that inform a writer or writers from a certain region. I was in conversation with Sasha for the panel on poetry, and we were talking about the same thing. Sasha pointed out, just like Hamad pointed out, the connections which go beyond our recent memory or our recent even corpus of knowledge or understanding. Sasha was pointing out relationships between the Vikings and Islam and the imprint of the word Ali on some Viking jackets. And we were just saying that, this, our imagination and our creative field or our creative peripheries are bounded very cruelly by the recency bias of the episodes of colonization, which we all have survived in our respective countries. And I feel that we have this collective responsibility to decolonize and decondition ourselves. I know that I'm waking up to this need very aggressively in my personal life, but I also sense that around me, in the world, in the creative communities that I'm a part of, wherever they are in the world, there's this rejection of this recent history which has been imposed on all of us and beyond which we could never see. And you speak to any writer, the influences that they cite are mostly either national or regional. And beyond that, I feel there's this cosmic, global sort of connectivity. There's so many reasons to be optimistic and hopeful about the times that we're living in. For example, There's so many symptoms to be alert to and to celebrate, and whose momentum we can build on. For example, this recent surge of translations from underrepresented languages or language groups that we are all a part of. This, I mean, nobody could have foreseen this 5 years ago. And because of the butterfly effect of elements and aspects in the world that we're living in, there is this, I mean, you can call it revolution or surge. There's this new heightened interest. And because of that interest, supporting that interest and driving the momentum of that interest is an entire machinery, which is also unprecedented. That machinery of support in terms of the grants and the opportunities and the connections now available to translators working out of South Asian languages. This was completely unprecedented 2 years ago. And I feel that because such is the power of colonization, such is the power of oppression or conditioning, it narrows your imagination, it narrows the limits of your creativity. And so we never thought beyond this. But now we see proofs that in that very narrow imagining of the world, there are dents, there are clear dents. The writing is on the wall. And you can't deny that. For example, who would have thought that a new generation would come about that would change the dynamics of publishing in literary translations and publishing? Who would have thought it would have been Gen Z? And they've completely inverted the balance of things. And, we can hope that it's going to go forward in the right direction. So there are all these things tying together, all these elements is this deep responsibility and relief, I feel, towards a decolonization of the self and a deconditioning. And when I look around at, the world that we're living in, yes, things are not perfect, but there are so many initiatives and so many portals of support which never existed like 5 years ago. So the work is hard, but the conversation has started.
Absolutely, Sabi.
Yeah, it's so interesting listening to both Hamad and Naima and Sabine. Thank you so much for having us and for kicking off this very interesting conversation. I was just thinking, and it's so interesting what both Hamad and Naima said about language, about the connections between languages, about translations, about the opportunities there are for translations now. So two things which I thought of was how are we thinking of language? Are we thinking of language specifically in terms of what can be written, what can be expressed on the page? What about languages which are not communicated necessarily through words? For example, I am very interested in women's literature, and often women's literature historically hasn't been written down. We see language through lullabies, we see language through songs, we see language through embroidery, we see language through recipes. So it's also important, I think, especially when we're talking about indigenous identities, when we're talking about translations, when we're talking about decolonization, to remember that language is not always that which is limited to the written word. So that's one thing that I think is interesting to explore. The other thing I was thinking about is two other things that I was thinking about. One was, we talked about translating from, in our languages into English, or from English into our languages, and how there are so many more opportunities for translators. There's an audience for translation. There's an appetite for international literature. But I also find myself thinking about Englishes within English. We often think of English as this singular language, and more so those of us who teach in universities or mediums where the language of instruction is English, and we're often encouraged to teach creative writing, or writing for academic purposes, scholarly writing, in a very sort of standardized way, this sort of standard English. But I have students from all over the world, and they would speak in Indian English, Pakistani English, Hong Kong English, Chinese English, Arabic English. There's so many different Englishes within the English language, and ever evolving, their vocabulary evolving. And this is also something to keep in mind when we think of our post-colonial legacy of language. Part of decolonization, I feel, is accepting the various Englishes within the English language, and having an opportunity for those voices to be expressed as well. In English language publishing. I hope to see more opportunities for that, along with translating from other languages. The third thing that I found interesting was what you mentioned, Sabine, about the blank spaces also expressing a kind of unwritten language, or saying that which cannot be said. And I think that liminal space, that lack of language opens up, is also something really, really interesting to keep in mind. This censorship and sometimes self-censorship of language that comes with those liminal spaces, those blank spaces where we insert dashes, or just a blank space where language is not allowed, where expression is not allowed. And how in that place, I'm thinking of, Arab Spring or Arab literature, where often metaphor is a way to express something that cannot be openly said. And I think that power of metaphor within different languages is also something really interesting. It's almost a form of resistance. It's almost a language in itself. So yeah, those are some thoughts that I wanted to share.
So it brings me to two questions, and going back to your question, Sabine, how are we thinking when we think about language? Because now, if you look at, generations who are coming after us, Gen Z, and, there's the graphic novel, right? So, and, starting from cave paintings to the graphic novel, that has a language, and generations, our children and their children, they are more attuned to, non-verbal, non-textual language. They're more into graphic novels, or, now there's metaverse, and it tells a different story, or, a different kind, or a different mode of storytelling. That's a different mode of storytelling. So are we going back to that? Should we go back to that? Because I feel not, it may be more, it may be more diverse or all embracing. What do you think of that? Does that make sense? Hamad, I'll go with you first.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Before I come to your question, Sabine, I would like to go back to what Sabine mentioned earlier about language or literature not just being limited to the oral tradition, to the written word or its written form, but also, I know there is a very rich oral tradition of storytelling, of narratives in our languages. So, for example, if you look at Pakistan, and there are a number of languages which are spoken in Pakistan, only some of them have a very long established sort of a written tradition. A lot of these languages, even, for example, some of the state languages like Balochi, which is the state language of Balochistan, for example, doesn't have a very long established written tradition of literature, but there are medieval sagas, medieval epics, which have been orally transmitted across generations. So it's definitely a very interesting and important point, not to limit limit the literature, the literary tradition to the written form or the written word only. We need to consider all the other types and all the other kinds of forms of expression and forms of narrative transmission as well. And I think your question, Sabine, is also kind of similar to that. That storytelling, for example, or this narrative transmission has been going on for ages, since you mentioned cave paintings and all that, but it has taken various forms of human creativity. So for example, one of the most established current forms of storytelling, novel, only goes back to medieval ages. It took influences from Eastern ways of storytelling, for example, oral dastan. But human creativity has adapted across generations to express itself, and I think what you mentioned just now, the graphic novel, for example, is also, I think it's a need and necessity of age, and it isn't just it isn't a very recent kind of a thing anyway. I would say, because there is a long tradition of graphic storytelling going back to the Japanese form of block painting, for example. So it has taken influences from that in a way, and then there's Disney and all that as well. So, but yeah, very interesting points. And yes,
Naima?
I'd like Sabine, this point that Sabine brought up about the tyranny of form, in which Hamad expanded on very beautifully. I think that is, once again, that's a symptom of colonization. You accept the tyranny of certain forms which are imposed by somebody else. Referencing this panel that I was talking about just now, we were talking about the tyranny of associating poetry with a book. Poetry is not supposed to be written or read in a book. You could be performing poetry. It belongs in public spaces. It belongs in the metro. You should go and write poetry in the forest. It belongs everywhere where we're living. And I was just thinking, when you look at our spaces and our forms of enjoying poetry, we have the mushaira, which is such an animated, such a zesty form of enjoyment. And there is no expectation of silence, and there's no expectation of a certain decorum or a certain behavior. The audience is participating. There's open applause, and there's this other level of energy. Whereas when you go to a poetry reading in the UK, whatever, the expectation is silence, and there's no show of expression. And I think anywhere in our lives where we are accepting the tyranny of a form, for example, if I'm saying, oh God, I have to check every single thing for grammatical correctness, that is a certain tyranny, because, what is a standard English? There are so many Englishes, as Sabine said. I lived in Singapore for a year, and there was Singlish, and they have like zero complex or zero concern about conforming to a correct English. They are very comfortable with their Singlish. We all know there are so many Indian Englishes. We all know there's Pakistani English, there's Pakistani Chinese. So, there's so many levels at which we need to, break down the walls and embrace it. Similarly, when we're writing poetry, this anxiety about form, that it either has to be a sonnet and it has to be a certain thing. Now, even the ghazal has been hijacked by English poets. Who set these rules? The tyranny of the should, it has to either be a sonnet or it's not good enough. I think that is a symptom of colonization, and that is something that we all need to battle. And once we address the issue at the core, when we reject that there are no forms, especially those which are imposed, especially those which are considered standardized, we're free to invent and reinvent. It opens up the world, it opens up the field for literally a limitless, infinite possibilities. And the graphic novels you mentioned, I've seen verse novels. I've seen such exciting formats for translation and for expression. Once we address the core, there's no limit to what we can explore.
Sabine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said about different forms, I think, language and storytelling has just exploded, and it's a good thing. It's also a bad thing because now everyone is telling a story. There's my story on Instagram, there's my story on Snapchat, there's my story on Facebook. Everyone has a story. I'm reminded of something that Muhammad Hanif once said in a panel we did when somebody said to him that I have a story inside me and I really want to write it. And he said, you also have kidneys and lungs. They don't have to come out as well, right? Not everything has to be expressed. But yeah, we live in an age of instant storytelling in so many different forms of storytelling, whether it's social media, whether it's a graphic novel. And similarly, languages have exploded. They're not limited anymore to a word. In one sense, yes, it's good. It's decolonizing when we think of language as not just the written form. But in another sense, it's also a new form of colonization, a kind of technological colonization, because now we have languages such as Python and whatnot. We have generative languages. We have AI, which is generating language for us. So I think we are again in this sort of liminal space between decolonization and double colonization. We are in this very, very transitional space where we are aware of the threats of the past, but perhaps not fully have not fully embraced what the future holds either, in terms of how language is going to evolve and how storytelling will evolve. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Sabine. And, while, isn't it ironic that, languages like English and Urdu, they're an amalgamation of other languages, but one is the language of the colonized, and the other is the language of the colonizer. If you can talk about this politicization of language, beginning with Naima.
Yeah. So even if, when English is the language colonizer, when that even the historical event of colonization was several decades ago. So the language, when it is taken up by any people, it becomes something else. And so it is a tool which anyone can use to their advantage. I am thinking all the time about everything that is clear to us in this recent Palestine conflict and how language and silence are weapons. And litmus tests. I've seen so many writers and so many academicians say that this Palestine event was a litmus test because people I thought were friends or allies or people I respected, their silence on this matter and their inaction and their apathy on the matter, I cannot go back to looking at them and to being in this circle of friends. I think every one of us with a conscience experienced something like that. So I would say that language is a tool. Yes, you can politicize it, but so is silence. This incident, it showed the true colors of so many institutions, so many people, because they did not exercise the right to raise their voice. What are we even doing in this world? Why are we calling ourselves creators or writers if we don't have a conscience and we don't know when to use our voice? Neutrality, what is that? It's a refuge of the cowardly. Why are you calling yourself a writer if you cannot dare to raise your voice and face the consequences that come with it? So for me, silence is as telling a tool, as political a tool as language.
Absolutely. As the phrase goes, pen is mightier than the sword. We don't see that as much as we should. Hamad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Naima said about language being a tool which can be used for anything. And it just reminded me, especially in the the example Naima gave about Palestine. Just today, I saw a social media post by Musab Abu Toha, one of the writers from Gaza, and he said that he's a bilingual poet. And he said that since 7 October, he hasn't written a single line of poetry in Arabic, because for him, the most important thing now was to communicate with as many people as he could. So, I mean, in terms of its practical use, I mean, we can't deny that English is a universal language, and it allows you to that accessibility, which other languages might not. But I mean, on the other hand, obviously, as you mentioned, Sabine, about English having this colonial colonial past, obviously, and you can't deny that either. And there have been movements and voices against its use by some of the writers who initially wrote in English and then decided not to write in English. I was reading about. I was reading an essay on Gikuyu, the language of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who decided in the, I think in the 80s, he decided not to write anymore in English, and only write in Gikuyu, because he says that every language has a genius, and by writing in English, he was enriching the genius of English at the expense of his own language, Gikuyu, which I found very poignant. And if we go closer to the homeland of English, I was looking at a poem by Michael Hartnett, an Irish poet, one of the foremost Irish poets of the last century, who wrote in both English and Irish. And he one of his poems is called Farewell to English, and in that he makes this conscious decision of only writing in Irish, but then at the end he says that English, and he had to fall back on the gravel of Anglo-Saxon. So he also doesn't, you can't deny the utility of English. And he says that in another place, he says English is a great language for selling and buying pigs, which I found very interesting about its utility.
Yeah, absolutely. Sabine, do you wish to add?
That's fine. I'd let you move on.
So my next question, basically, you spoke about Nyong'o, Hamad, and I recently read a piece on Medium, and I'd like to actually pose, copy paste the question, and it goes like this: Nyong'o has described English language and literature as a means of spiritual subjugation, responsible for taking post-colonial authors further and further from ourselves to other selves, from our worlds to other worlds. In contrast, Rushdie says that English is not irredeemably tainted by its cultural provenance and is simply one of a number of Indian languages. So who is right, and does it continue to matter? Sabine, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I have to say that while I understand what he was trying to say, and I do think that by writing in our mother tongues, we are adding to the growth of the literature. We are creating a diversity of stories coming from our parts of the world, and thus breaking what Adichie calls the dangers of the single story. But I also feel that, given that so many of us grew up speaking English, why should we give up that language, in the sense that why should we not claim it as our own language? I absolutely understand. I'm thinking of Audre Lorde's essay, "The Master's Tools," but at the same time, this is a language that, yes, it was imposed on us. The British Literature Act of 1800s. We're all familiar with the Education Act and how our own languages were taken out in favor of the English language in educational institutes in United India, therefore imposing this legacy of the English language, especially in higher institutions. However, it is something that we inherited. Yes, it is, a mournful inheritance. That was something that was, imposed. However, it is something that we can claim as, whether it's a decolonial legacy, whatever. But why give up a language? Yes, we are adding to that language, but in so many senses, we have claimed this language as our own, because, as we talked about, there are so many different varieties of English. It is no longer a singular language. It is no longer a monolingual, monolith language either. So in that sense, I suppose I lean more towards the Rushdie school when it comes to claiming English as a language, as an Indianized or as a localized language, rather than giving up in favor of one in favor of the other.
Naima, would you like to add to that?
I would agree with both the people that you quoted, but once again, I would say anyone making a call or a decision about which language to write so that they're adding to the genius of, the group that they're writing for. Once again, I would reject the tyranny of should. If writing in English makes sense to you, you should write in English. If writing in another language makes sense to you, you should reject English and write in it. But once again, if we accept it as a tyranny, oh God, because the English was the language of the colonizer, I think that's a very, very limited view to take of English. And I love Salman Rushdie for saying that it's an Indian language. That's enough to give the British a heart attack. English is just one of the Indian language. Yes, it is. Because it has stayed with us for so long. Why do we have to throw away once again at this new fad of rejecting English? Why do we have to throw away all those years of legacy, all those years of expertise that we have in the language? South Asian writers are very skilled writers in English language. Why should they roll back all those years that were spent developing expertise? Why shouldn't they write in English if they want to?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can I just add?
Please go on.
I think for me, the argument is refusing to write in a standardized English. And something that I encourage my creative writing students to do is to express the English that is, that is theirs. Whether they're from Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Pakistan, to write in the localized English that they can claim is their own language.
Sabine, if you look at the recent spate of translations which are published in English, you will see, I'm sure you know this, the notion of standardized English or, correct in English, whatever that meant, it's gone. It's long gone. The translations are so bold in assimilating words from other languages into an English sentence and not explaining because once again, when you're over-explaining, you're explaining every, let's say, Urdu or Punjabi word that you're using in an English sentence. Basically, what are you doing? You are nodding to the colonizer and you're writing for the white gaze, because to the white gaze, everything needs to be explained. So you're acting like a tourist guide rather than, a confident translator, and you're demanding the reader, including the white reader, also to pick up the dictionary or to Google and to meet you halfway. So I think this notion of the standardized English should rest in peace, and it's long gone already. I love the way these translators from other languages are, doing whatever they want to with English.
Unfortunately, I think that may be just limited to literary translations, because even now, if you submit an article into a journal, especially a scholarly journal, it will come back and you will be expected to standardize it into standardized English. So I think it's really wonderful that we are doing this in literature. I would like to very much see this expand in other areas of writing as well.
I think we might make a distinction between the standards of the gatekeepers for, academic writing versus perhaps creative writing, where there's more freedom. And once again, in academic writing, the approvals or the standards of quality are set by institutions which are either in the West or westward leaning. So perhaps the margin there might be narrower than it is for creative writing.
Absolutely.
I would like to add something about the point that you made, Naima, which is very good, about English being one of the Indian or Pakistani languages. And if we go back to pre-colonial era, for example, Persian was in a very similar sort of situation in India and Pakistan, the subcontinent. Persian was one of the languages that was one of the languages in which most of the literary engagement was happening in the pre-colonial era, and then after the advent of the British, obviously, it went out the window. But yeah, Persian was similarly the language of elite in a way, but also an Indian language, and there was a specific style of Indian Persian, Indo-Persian, which is famous for for example, its use of metaphor in terms of writing poetry and things like that, which is very similar to sometimes how Indian or Pakistani writers have written in English, coloring it with the hues of their own first languages, for example. So in that way, definitely, I mean, English is one of the languages of the subcontinent. But I think there's also a point that Thiongo makes, referring back to the essay that I read recently. It's called "Recovering the Original," and he talks about. He was thrilled to be published in English and being reviewed in the English language press. But the question he went back to was who he was writing for whom was he writing, and that's another thing I think which we need to consider, because English, although it has become our language in a way, for some reasons, it's still considered the language of the elite, and that's also, I think that's also an important question to explore. Who are we writing for, and whose story are we telling, and whether those people can access those stories. Because if you consider Pakistan versus India, I think the proportion of those who can read in English in Pakistan is much smaller than in India, I would imagine. So I think that's also an important question to explore when we think about writing in English. I don't know if we've got time to explore that now.
You can.
I would like to hear your thoughts, Naima and Sabine, on that as well, please.
I agree with that. Yes, it is a problem, Hamad, and it's once again, it's a problem at the infrastructural level, problem at the level of the publishing infrastructure and the distribution and education system, why India has such a large middle class and why we have such a small middle class. But once again, I mean, the gist of the matter here is that whoever is people should be writing in whichever language they are comfortable in expressing themselves in order to reach the greatest impact. And also the impact, it works in different ways and it's measured in different ways either. So if, for example, a book, a Pakistani writer writing in English writes a book, yeah, you can say that the market for that in Pakistan is really small, okay. But when the book makes its way internationally, and supposing it wins a prize or supposing it wins a critical acclaim, it all circles back to an increased readership in the home country in ways that you can't really imagine. So yes, that is a fact, what you say, but I wouldn't consider that a limitation, or I wouldn't worry too much about it if I was writing in English.
Yeah, I think you're very right, Hamad, about this question of audience, not just which language are we writing in, but who are we writing for? And I agree that it's not necessarily a bad thing because, sometimes, yes, language provides you access, but language can also provide you protection in that sense. For example, my book Hijabistan was written in English because it is written for a particular audience, because it could be dangerous if it was written in a language which is accessible to the wider readership of the country because of the cultural taboos that it is trying to highlight. So in that sense, yes, it can be limiting to write in the English language, but it can also, in certain circumstances, provide you a kind of cover. And by that, I don't mean self-censorship. I don't mean that by writing in a language which is not the language of the wider readership, we are self-censoring ourselves. What I'm trying to say is that having a different audience in mind is not always something that's a limitation. It can be a conscious choice as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. My last question to all of you before we end this session is, goes beyond language, and we all hear this term freedom of expression and know, especially now, this term does have a hollow ring to it. So what is freedom and what is liberation, and how do we attain it in the language with all these optics and all these messaging in the world of today, where, the media, the academic institutions, and others have become ringmasters? Hamad, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yes, I mean, going back to the situation in Palestine, for example, that's been going on for decades. And more recently, it's become very obvious who has the kind of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, because those who decide these matters sometimes don't agree with who should have that kind of freedom of speech, and it's a very sad situation, very disappointing situation to see that kind of thing happening right now. But I think it's also very very liberating to see those masks falling, and to see that you can recognize who is on your side and who is not. Yeah, these are my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. Naima?
I would say that expression, freedom or freedom of expression, courage, it's a muscle, and you don't get it in one gulp, in one go. It's a journey. You always get it by degrees, and like your workout, be stronger, to be fitter. It is something that you have to exercise every single day in whichever capacity you're in. Even if you're home, there's room to exercise courage. There's room, for example, to, I don't know, as an example, talk about menopause openly with the men in your house, even if they haven't heard about it, because, it's something that you need to do. So I would say that this is a daily exercise, it's a daily discipline. And I reject the idea of a language. It's languages for me. And I'm completely unconcerned and unlimited by form. I'm not thinking that, all right, there's an appetite for short stories or prose, and therefore I must write in prose. No. If I want to write a novel in verse, I will like it. I will write it. Similarly, your point about gatekeepers and policing agents within the infrastructure of writing, expression, and publishing, while there will never be an easy solution, I think it is within our power to reject the standards of quality set by them, that, if you are published in the New Yorker or the New York Times, then your work is good enough. Those masks have fallen, as Ahmad said. And we have a responsibility, each of us within the circle of our might, to create environments which are completely uninformed by those standards set. I think your festival can be called a good example. Another example is a recent publication started by Farah Ali, which is a magazine called Lakir. It publishes Pakistani writings from anywhere in the world. So these small acts of courage are always within our power, and we should continue doing them.
Thank you. Sabine?
Yeah, I agree. I think freedom is never free. I think you have to fight for it. I think you have to take responsibility for it. Absolutely, I think we are at crossroads at the moment. It's about, who has the loudest voice. And I think those smaller voices, those little whispers, it's time to give those lower voices space as well. And it's just absolutely heartening to see all these wonderful initiatives like yours, like Farah's, making space for those lesser heard voices. And I hope they continue. Yeah.
So much. We have just 1 minute. If there's any question or anyone would like to say anything, 1 minute. So.
No question, but I would just like to thank you for this opportunity and for facilitating this, festival and bringing these voices in open. Thank you for that.
Ditto.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sabine. It's always wonderful, and it's great that you have this annual initiative, and I know how much work you put into it. So. Thank you for creating this space.
Thank you. Thank you. This space has been created by all of us as a collective. So it's not just me or Ananke, it's all of you, coming together. So thank you for that. And with that, we are unfortunately at the end of this session. Thank you so much, Hamad, Naima, Sabine. And if you notice, I go alphabetically in all these conversations, but thank you so much. Next up, we have this amazing session, Reverie Publishers panel, the Abdus Salam panel, so stay tuned.